right, hello. In this video, we're going to talk some more about CSS specificity, which is namely how we tell when one rule is more specific than and therefore should apply instead of another rule or another selector. So I want to flag up ahead that you don't often need to worry about CSS specificity when you're writing CSS. It's actually something that it comes up when there's a problem. But so the fact that there's a whole video on this, don't take that as being this is the thing that's really, really important. You have to always be thinking about it. It's more of, here's the thing that's worth knowing because it's part of CSS. And if you encounter a problem, this might be related to that. But if you don't encounter problems, don't worry about it. It's fine. Okay, so in this video, what we're basically going to do is we're talking about how we determine selector specificity. So which selectors are more specific than others. All right, so we talked about specificity briefly when we talked about classes, right? We basically were saying that when we have two rules that conflict, right? We've got two rules that both are trying to apply the same property to an element. For example, right, if I have a paragraph with class Husky and I have rules that apply to paragraphs and rules that apply to the class Husky, which one wins? And as we mentioned in a previous video, in general, actually all the time, the more specific rule wins. So if you have two rules that are going to apply to an element, the one that's more specific is the one that wins. So we talked about then that class selectors are more specific than tag selectors. So class selectors would win out over tag selectors. But now what happens when we get to now we've learned about more complex CSS selectors, right? We've learned about ways we can combine them. We've learned about other kinds of selectors as well. How does that going to impact our specificity? So when we're determining the specificity of a selector, and we do it at the selector level, not look at the element, is for combined or more complex selectors, the way that we determine their specificity is by counting the number of selector parts that are used of each type. So how many ID selectors there are, how many class selectors there are, and how many element selectors there are. So, for example, if I have a selector that's just a paragraph, that has one element selector, so it gets a specificity of 1. There's one element selector. This rule, right, has a descendant selector here, right, but I've got two parts. I've got a nav part and an anchor part, so that's got 2 element selectors, so I would count that as 2 elements. This one has 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. This one has 1 class selector, so we talk about it having as a selector specificity of 1 class. This one has 1 element and 1 class, right? It's got both pieces. So we would talk about the specificity as being 1 class, 1 element, right? We've got 1 of each. Here's a more complex example, right? This is a div that refers to divs with the class alert and class success and then the strong elements inside of that, right? So imagine these are like the success alerts. We want the things that we've bolded to be colored a different way because they're, inside of a colored box, for example. This one has 2 classes, alert and success, and it's got 2 elements, div and strong. Note the order of these things don't matter. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if the alert success was on the div or if that was on the strong, right? We're literally just going through and counting them together. We don't care about whether there's a break with a descendant selector. We don't care about whether it's combined. We don't care about if it has any other selectors. We're just going ahead and counting the parts. This one would, of course, have an ID selector and then an element selector. We don't use IDs. To be clear, items that are in a group selector are counted separately. This part here is 1 selector on its own that has a specificity with 1 class. This thing here is a different selector that happens to be written in the same rule because we've grouped them together to save myself space. That's just a shortcut. This is considered a different selector. So it has a specificity of 1 element and 2 classes. We don't look at the entire group and say, oh, there are 3 classes and 1 element in here. No, we count them differently. These are considered separate for determining the specificity. So that this thing could be less specific and this thing could be more specific, and that's okay. That's how that works. All right, once you finish counting out the specificity, we then can order them based on those counts. And generally, we determine which is more specific by comparing the counts. So first, we consider IDs, because IDs are considered more specific than classes, because IDs always refer to as one exact specific element. You can't get more specific than that. Then we count the number of classes, then we count the number of elements. So I've reordered these based on which is the highest specificity. I put the highest specificity ones in the top. I should put them in the bottom, but I put them at the top in order to sort of show how this works. So my side nav A has 1 ID, 0 classes, and 1 element. So it has a specificity of 101, or you can read the specificity as 101. It's pretty high. It's a big number for specificity. The next one we had on our list was our div that had a class live alert success strong. This had 2 classes and 2 elements. So let's see. So it has 0 divs, 2 classes, 2 elements. So we put them in that order, right? IDs, classes, elements, and that gives us a specificity of 22. P.alert has 1 class, 1 element, so it's got specificity of 11. Dot highlighted, it just has the 1 class, so it has specificity of 10, right? 0 elements. ULs have a specificity of 3, right? Because there's 3 elements in here, but no classes, so it'd be 0, 0, 3. Nav is 0, 0, 2, and paragraph is, of course, 0, 0, 1. And looking at those numbers, we can then see which is bigger, right? The one that has a higher number is considered more specific. Now, we don't actually write them as 101 or 22 because having 10 classes is not, doesn't trade, like it's not 10 classes doesn't carry over to the IDs place, right? So it's not actually 10 and 1, it's not actually 100, it's really 3 different numbers. So like this could be, you can have a specificity that might be 0, 12, 3. That rule is horrifying, you probably never do that, but that's how we can do that. Okay. When you're writing out CSS, right? If you put this into into Visual Studio will show you that specificity. So if you hover over the property, right? Notice how we've been currently looking at how it tells us what element that refers to. There's also this other thing down here where it'll tell you the specificity of that selector. So you don't even have to count it on your own. Visual Studio will count it for you. But that's what it's doing, right? So in this case, when it says 022, it means there are 0 ID attribute elements selectors in here. There are 2 classes and there's 2 elements. And it uses that to determine which has higher specificity. In practice, I have this in the order wrong. Really, we should have put the more general rules first and the more specific rules later, because the more specific rules will win. So we then put them at the bottom. But again, I want to show you how this thing gets counted. So it's backwards. Okay. So that's the basic idea about determining which rule is more specific than another rule. You count them up, and the higher number wins. That said, if you have 2 rules on your page that have equal specificity, they get equal numbers, right? They're both 3, they're both 12, they're both 22. If they have the exact same counts, no matter how that's been organized, they have the exact same counts, then the later rule on the page wins. So in this case, these are 2 simple rules, right? This one has a specificity of 10, 0, 1, 0. There's also a specificity of 10, 0, 1, 0, because there's 0 IDs, 1 class, 0 tags. Therefore, they're both 10, but the later one in the CSS file will win. The idea being, like you said, okay, great, paint all walls in the kitchen. Now we said paint all walls. Now we said paint all walls again. The one when we tell it to do the second time, that paints over the first time, so that overrides it. All right, so if I have my paragraph that is both the class alert, so this rule applies, and class highlighted, so this rule applies, it's going to end up being yellow because that's the rule it's going to win. So the line here, right, same thing we talked about before, right, is the more specific rule wins, and we can determine specificity by counting. But if 2 rules are equally specific, then the later rule is the one that applies, right? It overrides the previously defined rule that's equally specific. And that's the basic idea behind specificity, right? There's not actually that much to it. You count, and the things that are higher count win. I mentioned this before, but I really want to don't worry about specificity too much. What you should do when writing CSS is write CSS that's semantically appropriate, that makes sense, right? Follow the heuristics we talked about in the previous video. Write general rules that'll apply to general elements, and then use a couple of classes if you need to make things more specific than that. When people are talking about styling, and so when you talk about decorating, if you talk about anything, any kind of rules, people tend to naturally, just as the way English works and the way we communicate with each other, we tend to talk about things in increasing order of specificity, right? If I'm trying to tell someone to paint the kitchen, I would say, okay, let's paint the kitchen yellow, but that wall, make it purple. We don't say that wall makes purple and the rest are yellow. I mean, we could do that, but that's being now I'm being specific, right? That wall is specific, and these walls, the rest are equally specific. But generally, we're not going to say paint that wall purple, paint the kitchen yellow. Because if I told someone to do that, they'd be like, well, wait a second, which did you want? Did you want it to be purple or did you want it to be yellow? Because you said the kitchen is yellow, but you said that one for like, which do you do first? And it generally doesn't happen, right? We'll say paint the kitchen yellow and paint that wall purple. That's how we communicate. And so that's what CSS rules will do, right? In general, paint all paragraphs yellow, but that particular paragraph, that styling, make it purple. So we tend to talk about things in this kind of naturally increasing specificity way, just when we're talking about designing and styling pages. So if you think about writing your CSS rules to follow that kind of conversation, right? How would you explain to somebody else what the page looks like? Well, okay, all paragraphs look like this, except that paragraph that looks different. If you follow that kind of way you would explain to somebody else and use that when writing your rules, just write it in the same way you would explain it in English, you won't have any problems with specificity. It'll all work the way you want because you're going to communicate in ways that follow the specificity rules. But the reason we talk about this is that occasionally you will find a rule that isn't applying for some reason, right? You've written a rule that says, okay, I want these images to look this way, and you apply it to your page, but the images don't change, right? It looks like your rule's not working. If you then open up your developer tools, right, we go say, okay, what rules are applying? Sorry, I love my hovering stuff in here. Right, we say what rules are applying to this. We can look in our developer tools and we'll see that, oh, my rule is getting overridden by this other more specific rule that was written somewhere else in my CSS file that I forgot about, or I didn't know, or it's coming from another CSS file because I'm working within, WordPress or a framework or something else, or some system that like has a bunch of code that I didn't write. So now I need to work within that. So specificity is one of those things that comes up when there's a problem, when you try to do something that doesn't work. It's not something you need to keep in that you need to be thinking about all the time as you're sort of generating new content. So what I then generally do is I'll say, okay, I'm going to write my rule the way I want, right? As general as I can, but specific as I need to be. And then when I then load my page, it doesn't work, I'll investigate why. I'll say first, okay, let me check. I'll open up the developer tools and now I'll first check to see, is the element applying? Right? Is that rule applying? Or I'll see, is it actually listed down here? And if it is, great. I know that's not my problem. Then I'll be, okay, why is that property being crossed out, right? Is it being overridden? And I'll look to see what other rule is doing that work. And if I find some other rule that's doing that work that's more specific, I'm going to slightly increase the specificity of my rule until I win. And that's kind of how this works. You can see my favorite examples of this. You can see, and this, I'll have to see if this work. Yeah, okay. So like if we go look at this is the Info 340 book, right? Which I wrote as the HTML, but there's like a number, you can see that this that the framework I've used to build this as a book comes with a lot of hyper specific rules, right? So this is a rule that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 classes and 2 elements, right? It's a specificity of 52. Which means if I don't know why it does that. It's because that's how this framework is built, because they were trying to be hyperly specific because they have a bunch of different things that are like mixing together. Right. So what I then do is I've said, okay, if I want to then style this to make like headings look a different way, I would have to write, I'm not sure if this is an example, I would have to write a rule that would be this, at least this specific, right? At least 52 in order for my rule to apply. So what I've had to do is I've occasionally, when I want to style things on my own, I have to say, okay, great. I can't just say style my H1s. I have to say style my H1s that are inside of all this stuff, right? I have to include that same kind of like preamble. And that's what you do, right? You say, okay, let's figure out how specific is something that is overriding me and then make my rule as specific as it has to be in order to make that work. But of course, if you can go to that other overly specific rule and change it so it's not hyper specific, if I could go back to just saying like normal sections H1s, that would make my life better, right? That makes it easier. So often when we're trying to fix CSS rule bugs and problems with sort of over specificity, the best solution is actually to make other rules more general rather than trying to make your rule more specific. We'll see this more as we talk about adding more properties and doing more CSS stuff, but you'll often find that debugging and fixing CSS problems, the solution is often to actually remove code, right? Get rid of things that are getting in the way rather than trying to add more stuff and kind of increase the complexity. But so yeah, it's the same thing that's about specificity. So we've talked about sort of this basic idea, right? These are my specificity rules. And then that's how they work. That's how counting can exist. But in practice, don't panic. Just write your rules the way you'd explain it, how you want something to be decorated, and that'll work out just fine.